Here's your 30-day eviction notice. This is our place now, and we want you out, my roommate Victoria's boyfriend Jake announced as he thrust a crisp legal document into my hands, his smirk carrying the confidence of someone who believed his father's law degree made him untouchable. My dad drafted this himself, so don't even think about fighting it. Victoria and I are starting our lives together, and we don't need a third wheel cramping our style. Victoria stood behind him in the doorway of what she apparently believed was now their apartment, her expression mixing defiance with something that looked almost like pity for my situation. But why did I calmly pocket the fake eviction notice instead of arguing, and why, exactly 20 minutes after I made a single phone call, did Victoria's confident expression collapse into horror when my property manager arrived and asked, "Ms. Ashford, is there a problem here?" "Marcus, thank you for coming so quickly." "Of course. You said there was an issue with Unit 4B. Marcus glanced at the document Jake had handed me. "Is this what I think it is? My roommate's boyfriend has decided to evict me from my own building." Marcus's eyebrows rose as he examined the paper. Then he started laughing, a genuine, uncontrolled laugh that filled the hallway. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, "do you know who owns this building?" Victoria's face cycled through confusion. "The landlord is some corporation. Pacific Property Holdings or something." "Pacific Property Holdings is owned by Vivian Ashford, the woman your boyfriend just tried to evict." Marcus gestured toward me. "She owns this building. All 16 units. She's been your landlord for the past 18 months. The silence that followed was everything I'd imagined it would be. The building had been my grandmother's final gift. Eleanor Ashford had spent 40 years in real estate, quietly accumulating properties while raising her family and projecting the image of a comfortable but unremarkable life. When she'd passed 3 years ago, her estate had revealed a portfolio nobody had expected, 12 properties across the city, including the 16-unit apartment building where I now lived. I'd inherited everything. At 26, I'd become a landlord of significant holdings, owner of properties worth approximately $8.7 million. But I'd chosen to keep this quiet, living modestly in one of my own units, maintaining my job as a graphic designer, telling no one about my actual financial situation. The anonymity had been deliberate. I'd learned from my grandmother that wealth attracted certain kinds of attention, people who wanted favors, relationships built on what you could provide rather than who you were, friendships that evaporated when the money did. So I'd kept quiet. Lived simply. Let people assume I was struggling like everyone else. Victoria had been one of those people. We'd become roommates through a mutual friend 18 months earlier. I'd been looking for someone to share the 2-bedroom unit, not because I needed the rent money, but because I was lonely. The building was well maintained but quiet, mostly occupied by young professionals and retirees who kept to themselves. Victoria had seemed perfect. Friendly, responsible, employed at a marketing firm downtown. We'd gotten along well initially, shared dinners, movie nights, the comfortable rhythms of compatible cohabitation. Then Jake had entered the picture. Jake Harrison was the kind of man who'd been told his entire life that he was exceptional. His father was a senior partner at a mid-tier law firm. His mother ran a successful interior design business. He'd grown up with private schools, European vacations, and the unshakable belief that the world existed to accommodate his preferences. He'd started staying over occasionally, then frequently, then constantly. His presence had transformed the apartment. His belongings accumulated in common spaces. His opinions dominated conversations. His needs superseded everyone else's. Jake thinks we should redecorate the living room. Jake doesn't like when you cook fish, the smell bothers him. Jake needs the guest bathroom, so you'll have to use the hall one. I'd tolerated it because confrontation was exhausting and Victoria had been, before Jake, a good roommate. But tolerance has limits. The eviction attempt had been the culmination of months of escalating entitlement. Jake had decided he was moving in permanently. The apartment, my apartment, in my building, was now theirs. And I, the actual owner of the property, was being evicted. The notice his father had drafted was laughable from a legal standpoint. Victoria wasn't on the lease as a tenant, she was a subtenant, authorized by me, with no legal standing to evict anyone. Jake had never been on any document. And even if the situation had been what they believed, the notice lacked proper legal form, adequate notice period, or valid grounds for eviction. It was an amateur performance of authority by someone who'd never had his authority questioned. "This has to be a mistake," Victoria said, looking between me and Marcus. "You can't own this building. You're a graphic designer. You barely make rent." "I've never struggled to make rent. I've never struggled at all. I just didn't see any reason to tell you about my financial situation. But you drive a 10-year-old car. I like my car. It runs well and doesn't attract attention. You shop at Target. Target has good prices on household items. Being wealthy doesn't mean being wasteful. You complained about the cost of groceries last month. Because groceries have gotten expensive. That's a factual observation, not evidence of poverty. Victoria's worldview was visibly recalibrating. Every assumption she'd made about me, about our relative positions, about who had power in our relationship, was being demolished in real time. Jake attempted recovery. This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding. If you actually owned this building, you would have said something. Why? Why would I advertise my financial situation to my roommate and her boyfriend? Because normal people don't hide things like that. Normal people also don't try to evict their roommates using fake legal documents prepared by their fathers. We've both made unusual choices, Jake. Marcus stepped forward, his professional demeanor returning. Ms. Ashford, would you like me to explain the actual legal situation to these individuals? Please. Marcus's explanation was thorough and devastating. The eviction notice was legally worthless. Victoria's tenancy was authorized through an informal subletting arrangement with no independent lease rights. Jake had no standing whatsoever, he wasn't a tenant, a subtenant, or even an authorized occupant. Furthermore, Marcus continued, if anyone is subject to eviction here, it's Ms. Victoria Martinez. Her subletting agreement was predicated on certain conditions, including not allowing unauthorized long-term guests. Mr. Harrison's extended presence appears to violate those conditions. You can't evict me, Victoria said. I have rights. You have the rights specified in your agreement with Ms. Ashford. That agreement allows her to terminate your tenancy with 30 days' notice for various reasons, including unauthorized occupancy. Marcus paused. Would you like me to prepare actual eviction paperwork, Ms. Ashford? I let the question hang in the air, watching Victoria and Jake absorb the reversal of their situation. Not yet. Let's talk first. The conversation that followed happened in the living room, with Marcus waiting in the hallway. Victoria sat on the couch she'd apparently planned to keep in her apartment. Jake stood behind her, his earlier confidence replaced by something resembling calculation. Why didn't you tell me? Victoria asked. Why would I? You were my roommate, not my financial advisor. My wealth wasn't relevant to our living arrangement. But we were friends. Were we? Friends don't scheme to evict each other. Friends don't let their boyfriends treat shared spaces like conquered territory. Friends don't participate in fake legal proceedings to take what doesn't belong to them. Jake said his dad knew what he was doing. Jake's dad either deliberately created a fraudulent document or doesn't understand basic tenancy law. Either way, relying on him was your choice. Jake attempted negotiation. Look, this has been a misunderstanding. We didn't know you owned the building. Let's just forget this happened and start fresh. Start fresh how, exactly? You've been treating this apartment like you own it for months. You tried to evict me from my own property. What does fresh look like after that? We can pay more rent. Contribute more to expenses. I don't need your money, Jake. I own 16 units in this building. The rent from this apartment is irrelevant to my finances. Then what do you want? I want you to understand something. You walked into my home, with a fake legal document, and told me I had to leave. You did this because you assumed I was powerless, that your father's law degree and your family's resources made you untouchable. I stood, moving to the window that overlooked the street. You were wrong about the power dynamics. Completely wrong. And now you're asking me what I want, as if we're negotiating between equals. I turned back to face them. We're not equals in this situation. I'm your landlord. You're not even supposed to be living here. The only question is whether I choose to let this slide or whether I exercise the rights I actually have. The silence stretched until Victoria broke it. What are you going to do? That depends on what you do next. Here are the options. I'd thought about this during the 20 minutes between my phone call and Marcus's arrival. The satisfaction of immediate eviction would be considerable, but I'd learned from my grandmother that measured responses often served better than dramatic ones. Option 1, Jake leaves. Tonight. He removes all his belongings, returns his key, and doesn't spend another night in this building. Victoria, you stay under revised subletting terms, higher rent, reflecting Jake's absence, and a formal written agreement that specifies exactly what happens if you violate the conditions. And option 2? Jake asked. Option 2, I begin actual eviction proceedings against Victoria tomorrow. You can fight it, hire your father, go through the legal process, but you'll lose. The evidence is clear, the violations are documented, and I have considerably better lawyers than a mid-tier personal injury attorney who moonlights in real estate. Jake's face reddened. My father isn't a personal injury attorney. Harrison and Associates. I looked them up when you started staying here regularly. Personal injury, with some contract work and the occasional real estate matter. Your father hasn't handled an eviction case in 7 years, and he lost that one. You investigated my father? I investigate everyone who spends significant time in my properties. Background checks, legal history, financial stability. Standard due diligence. The revelation landed like another blow. I'd known more about Jake than he'd ever imagined, and I'd been watching, waiting, documenting, while he'd assumed he was the one with power. Victoria made the decision. Jake, you need to go. What? Victoria, we can fight this. With what? She owns the building. She has documentation. She has lawyers. We have a fake eviction notice your dad apparently printed in his home office. We can find somewhere else to live. I don't want to find somewhere else. I like this apartment. I like this neighborhood. I've lived here for 18 months, and I'm not giving that up because you decided to play landlord. But we were going to build a life together here. Here isn't yours to offer. It never was. Victoria looked at Jake with an expression I'd never seen before, clear-eyed assessment rather than adoration. You walked in here and tried to throw out my roommate like she was trash. You didn't ask what I wanted. You didn't consider whether this might backfire. You just assumed your father's name would fix everything. I was trying to give us a future. By taking something that belonged to someone else. That's not building a future. That's stealing one. Jake left that night. His belongings filled the back of his BMW, the expensive car he drove, financed by his parents, that had somehow never clued me into his family's actual resources. He didn't say goodbye. Just loaded boxes, shot me a look of pure hatred, and drove away. Victoria watched from the window. I really thought he loved me, she said quietly. He might have. But he loved the idea of power more. I'm sorry. For all of this. I didn't know about the eviction until he handed you the paper. I believe you. That's why you're still here. The revised subletting arrangement was signed the following week. Victoria's rent increased by 30%, still below market rate, but enough to reflect the changed circumstances. The agreement included specific provisions about guests, modifications to the unit, and the consequences of future violations. This feels like a business arrangement now, Victoria said as she signed. It always was a business arrangement. You just didn't know who you were doing business with. Does it have to stay that way? Can we ever go back to being friends? I considered the question carefully. Maybe. But friendship requires trust, and trust requires honesty. You weren't honest with me about Jake's growing presence. You weren't honest about your plans for the apartment. You let someone try to evict me from my own home. I didn't know it was your home. You knew it was my living space. You knew I had rights. You chose to let Jake steamroll those rights because confronting him was uncomfortable. Victoria absorbed this without argument. You're right. I made choices that prioritized Jake's comfort over your boundaries. I'm sorry. The apology was a beginning, not a resolution. The following months tested whether the relationship could recover. Victoria was more careful now, conscious of boundaries, respectful of shared spaces, thoughtful in ways she hadn't been when she'd believed she had the upper hand. The dynamic had fundamentally changed. She knew who I was now, not just a roommate but her landlord, the owner of the building, someone with resources and power she'd never suspected. That knowledge made her more careful. Whether it made her more genuine, only time would tell. Jake's aftermath revealed more about his character. He'd apparently told everyone who would listen that his girlfriend had been stolen by her wealthy landlord, that Victoria had been seduced by money, that the eviction attempt had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The narrative cast him as a victim rather than an aggressor. He's telling people you manipulated me, Victoria reported one evening. Let him. The people who know the truth know it. The people who believe his version weren't worth knowing anyway. It doesn't bother you. I've been wealthy long enough to understand that some people will always resent you for having what they want. Jake wanted power, and he discovered he didn't have it. His story is how he copes with that discovery. The building continued to run smoothly. Marcus managed the properties with the same efficiency he'd always shown, handling maintenance requests and tenant issues while I maintained my anonymous presence in Unit 4B. Other tenants had no idea who I was. They paid rent to Pacific Property Holdings, dealt with Marcus for repairs, and assumed their landlord was some faceless corporation. I preferred it that way. 6 months after the eviction attempt, Victoria moved out voluntarily. She'd gotten a job offer in Seattle, a promotion, better money, the chance to start fresh somewhere nobody knew about Jake or the humiliating reversal of the eviction attempt. I want to thank you, she said on her last day. Not for letting me stay, I mean, yes, for that too, but for showing me what I was becoming with Jake. What do you mean? I was becoming someone who went along with things. Who didn't question whether something was right as long as it was easy. Who let someone else make decisions because confronting them was uncomfortable. And now? Now I know what that leads to. I know what it feels like to watch your assumptions collapse because you never questioned them. She paused at the door. The eviction notice was the worst moment of my life, not because of what you did, but because of what I'd allowed to happen. That's a valuable lesson. An expensive one. I lost a good living situation, a relationship I thought was real, and a roommate who turned out to be much more interesting than I ever realized. You didn't lose the roommate entirely. We can stay in touch. I'd like that. But I think I need to earn it first. Be someone worth knowing before asking to be known. Victoria left for Seattle, and I found a new roommate, a quiet graduate student who appreciated affordable housing and didn't ask questions about my financial situation. The building continues to generate steady income. My other properties continue to appreciate. The wealth my grandmother left me continues to grow through careful management and strategic investment. And I continue to live simply in Unit 4B, driving my 10-year-old car, shopping at Target, complaining about grocery prices when they rise too quickly. The eviction notice Jake had prepared still sits in my desk drawer. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. A reminder that power often exists where people least expect it. That assumptions about who has authority can be completely wrong. That the person serving you coffee might own the building, the quiet neighbor might control the property, the unassuming roommate might be your landlord. Jake had assumed his father's law degree and his family's resources made him untouchable. He'd been touching the wrong person. They handed me an eviction notice in my own building. This is our place now, the boyfriend said, smirking. Jake's dad is a lawyer. I made one phone call. 20 minutes later, my property manager arrived, and my roommate's face collapsed when she learned I owned the building. All 16 units. The fake eviction notice became evidence of their attempted fraud. The boyfriend who thought his father's law degree made him powerful discovered that power existed in places he'd never thought to look. I'd lived anonymously among my own tenants because wealth attracts the wrong kind of attention. They proved exactly why that caution was necessary. The boyfriend left that night. My roommate stayed, under revised terms, and eventually became someone worth knowing. And the eviction notice? It sits in my desk drawer, a reminder that assumptions about power can be completely, catastrophically wrong.